Amen. So this is our third week in the book of Romans. We're taking 11 weeks to go through the book of Romans. And I've heard some pastors take like 3 years to go through Romans. And that's because they like to dig into all the nitty-gritty details and stuff. And my general perspective on stuff like that is that I don't want to present things to you that you can't get for yourselves, because the Bible is good enough all by itself. And so I take larger sections because what I want to do is give you the big idea, help you grasp the big picture. Because quite often, especially when we're studying the Apostle Paul, and you'll see it today, we're going to hit a couple passages today that you just feel the need to go to the details. You feel the need to say, what does that mean? And to dig in. And that's good. It's good to get into the details. But sometimes we spend so much time on the details that we miss the big picture. We miss the overall argument, the point. And this point today starts in Romans 3, verse 21, where we find the most beautiful but that's ever been found. Paul starts that verse with the word but. And when we get there, you will know how important and beautiful and wonderful that is, okay? That Paul would give us a big but. But so, I like big buts. In Romans 3:21, and only there. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so anyway, moving right along. Paul gives us this amazing thing coming up in Romans 3. But you cannot understand Romans 3:21 and 22, which some have called the most important verses in the whole Bible. You can't understand Romans 3:21 and 22 unless you get Romans 4:18 through 25. So we have to cover it all. We have to go all the way from the one to the other. It's going to be a lot of stuff. You're going to have to strap on your thinking caps and get your foot on the gas pedal, because we're going to race through this thing. But in order for us to understand it, let me set the stage with where we've been last couple of weeks. The first week, we just found out that Paul is sold out to a message of great news about Jesus. Paul is absolutely sold out to it. Everything he thinks, everything he does, everything he tries to teach to people is based on this good news, this great news, this message that Jesus has come and what it means that he's come. Paul is sold out to it. Then last week, he gives us the worst possible news that can ever be given. So he tells us there's great news, but before he gets to the great news, he gives us the worst possible news. And he starts the worst possible news by talking about the worst possible people. And in Romans chapter 1, he was telling us about people who reject God, people who worship creation rather than the Creator, people who build idols and worship and pray to piles of rock that looks like an animal as if that idol were a god. And Paul tells us about the worst of the worst, the people who've rejected God. And he tells us about those people that God has handed them over in God's wrath. He's handed them over to whatever their hearts desire. Just go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and live that way. And the first thing Paul tells us about are the shameful lusts that people get into, the various kinds of sexual immorality and indulgence that people get into. And so he lists off that, he talks about all that, and it's easy for people, especially religious people, to point their fingers at those guys, you know, the idolatry people and the shameful lust people, and to point their finger at them and to say, those people are the wicked people and they deserve God's wrath. So then Paul goes to the next level. And he says, now let's talk about the other thing God hands people over to. God hands people over to their own stupid way of thinking. Paul's words are depraved mind or foolish thoughts. Paul says God hands people over to their own way of thinking. And the end result of that is they do dumb things, like they are greedy, like they murder, like they tell lies. And worst of all, they disobey their parents. Yup, in that list, in Romans chapter 1, we find out that disobeying your parents is a crime worthy of death, equivalent to murder. And you say, how could Paul say that? Well, the Old Testament said it. So Paul is only listing off things in the Old Testament, things that were part of God's law, that all of us have done wrong. You might not be a murderer, but you're a disobeyer. I know that. Every one of us has had moments of disobeying our parents. And if you think you haven't, then you just did one of the other things in the line, which is lying. So, okay, you have disobeyed your parents. We all have. We're all guilty of death. Okay? So what happens to most people when they realize that my morals are not good enough? That's right. They turn to religion. And they say, because my morals aren't good enough to get me to God, I'm going to go to religion. And I'm going to say, maybe if I've got the right religion, if I've got the right faith, if I've got the right thing going on, if I know the right words and I go to church at the right time and I've been part of this right group of people, then maybe God is going to forgive me. And so Paul addresses that category of people. The religious people of his day were the Jewish people. And he says, so you're a Jew and you think you can point your finger and judge these other people, these wicked people, even those who disobey their parents and those who murder and those who worship idols? You think you can judge those people? Well, you're not perfect either. So therefore, you're out. And he closes the whole thing. The worst possible news is he says, every single human being on the face of the planet, Paul's words, not mine, is worthless. He says there is no one who's done good. They have all become worthless. Every human being, worthless. That's the worst possible news. God requires righteousness, meaning always doing the right thing, never doing the wrong thing, thinking the right thoughts, doing the right actions. God requires righteousness, okay? And you're not. God's wrath is poured out on everybody who's unrighteous. And that's you. And that's me. That's the worst possible news. And unless you grasp the hopelessness of those words, the rest of what we talk about today isn't going to matter. Unless you fully enter into the hopelessness that God requires absolute perfection, righteousness, and we're not, then today's passage makes no sense. You can go to church your whole life, and you will never understand the core of what God is talking about until you understand the hopelessness of this truth that God requires righteousness and we're not. Last week, I got a text message at about 1:30 in the afternoon from someone who had been in our service. She sent me a text message, and the content of her text message was, in the middle of your sermon, I felt like I was going to throw up. That's what every pastor wants to hear. Because my sermon was so bad, because my message was so bad, or because she got it. Because she understood the hopelessness of this situation. That we were talking about the depths of our sin and God's wrath against our sin. And there you go. She felt it. She got it. And all of us should feel the same way. It should make us sick to our gut that God demands righteousness and we're not. It's in that context of hopelessness that Paul begins Romans 3:21 with the word but. And it's the only way that word means what it needs to mean. We are hopeless. We are sinful. We are unrighteous. And we are deserving of God's wrath. But, go with me there. Romans 3:21. But now. There's something, I'm going to unpack this verse just phrase by phrase as we go through it so that we get the full impact of it. Paul says, but now. But is the word that turns the corner. But is the word that says all that stuff I was just talking about. We have another opportunity. We have another option. Now is the word that tells us this is the way things were before, but times are changed. Times are different. Something is true now that wasn't true then. Something is present now that wasn't present then. Something is real now that wasn't real then. All that stuff is true. God's wrath is against the unrighteous, but now, there's a new thing. What is the new thing? What's the thing that has happened in Paul's history? Not just in terms of sort of general spiritual terms, but in real actual history. What's the thing that has happened in history to change time from before till now? What's the thing that causes the line from before to after? But now something has happened. Let's keep going. He says, but now, apart from the law. Now, this is another important thing because Paul is a Pharisee, which means he's a Jewish person who's addicted to the law. He's committed to the law. And from his perspective, everything in the universe is under God's law. Okay? Everything in the universe. The creation itself displays the glory of God and his law. That's from Psalm 19. I think it's 19. Man, now I've got to go back and check it. Oh, anyway, so here you go. God's law is part of creation, and everything in the entire universe is under this umbrella of God's law. That's what Paul would say. So what is something that's outside God's law? Well, that's wrong. That's sin. That's evil. That's the stuff we should avoid. Paul doesn't use the word outside. He uses the word apart. But now, something apart from the law, something completely different from the law, something that's not outside it, as if it could be inside it, but something that is completely different, a completely different category of the law. It's not the law at all. It's something completely different, apart from the law. What is something that we can think of that would be not outside God's law, but just not the written code? He says, apart from the law, the righteousness of God. The word of there in Greek means the same thing it means in English, of. But that word of in English or any language that uses this kind of word actually is a very ambiguous word. It means maybe the righteousness God owns, his own personal righteousness, the righteousness of God. Just like if I said, the car of Jeff, that's my car, right? The righteousness of God. Or maybe righteousness of God is referring to righteousness that God gives, or righteousness that God uses, or something like that. That maybe this is the righteousness, if righteousness is a verb or something, that God is all about. So you could say, the preaching of Jeff. I don't own preaching, but maybe it's something that I'm doing, okay? This is an ambiguous word, and I want you to carry the ambiguity with you. Is it righteousness from God? Is it righteousness he possesses? Which is it? Keep going. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known. How do you know if someone is righteous? Well, the only way I know how to know someone's righteous is if they're doing the right thing, right? And you only know if it's the right thing if there's a law to tell you it's the right thing. So the only possible way I understand righteousness is if something is inside the law doing the law, right? So how can you reveal righteousness that is apart from the law? I don't get it yet, but maybe this last piece will give us a hint. To which the law and the prophets testify. And for Paul, law and prophets is a phrase meaning the entire Old Testament. And there are two very consistent things that the law and the prophets both testify to. Number one, they testify that God